YouTube is. It's easy to think that everyone is just buying the top end gear, the latest, best cameras as soon as they come out, buying all the top fancy lenses for it, and like multiple bodies of them and all this kind of stuff. And that's just not the case whatsoever. I think that YouTube can be really misleading when it comes to what gear people own. I was poor when I was younger. I didn't have the money to buy camera gear and get stuff. So it was really difficult for me, and it took a long time to save up for different bits and pieces. So my evolution was very much a upgrade as I go along. And there's really nothing wrong with doing that. As I was upgrading over time, and as I could buy gradually better equipment, bought myself a D600. Well, I bought two of them because you need two cameras. And I'd shot a few weddings at that point on a much older body. And I had saved enough money from doing the weddings to be able to buy a couple of D600s. There were better cameras, like you had the 800 around and so on, and D3S and things like people I were looking up to were shooting, but I didn't have the money to buy that. So I got the D600. And then as time went by, I then used that camera successfully and shot loads and loads of weddings on it. I probably shot a couple of hundred weddings on D600 cameras. Through all the different cameras that I've owned and tried out and tested over the years, what I found was that there's always a bar, which once you go above, your life as a photographer, it becomes relatively easy. Now, as technology gets better, those things do make your life easier, but you pay a price for it. And when you finish with that camera, it's probably not going to be worth anything much anymore. So when you buy a camera for wedding photography, you have to understand that that camera is not going to be worth much by the time you come to sell it. So as an investment, you're going to kind of lose that money on it. But you have like a bar beyond which the camera can do its job. And I found the D600 excelled that bar for me. So let's get into some of the reasons why. I'm going to cover some of the downsides with this camera because it does have some downsides, but I'm also going to give you enough of the upsides. Now, I've owned 4 of these in my time, and this is the first one I bought. It is knackered now. It is really like, it works still fine, but it's been pretty heavily used. Right now, you could buy these used, quite a low shutter count for about £450, I think, something like that. I don't know what that is in dollars. It's probably like 550 or 600, something along those lines. Now, that's not cheap still, but in terms of this kind of a camera body, it is cheap. And it gives you a lot for the money. There's no wedding that I've ever struggled at with this, and I've shot all types of venues, and it's handled everything that's been thrown at it. It's just absolutely handled it. The things that you get with this is dual card slots to start with. And one of the things that's good with this is it's both SD cards. And the reason I like that is because SD cards are just very, very available. And it's just the old type of SD cards. You don't have to buy any fancy cards for it or anything. It just, you buy I'd still buy the SanDisk Extreme Pro, but you don't have to buy the UHS 2 or whatever it's called. You don't have to buy that. You can just get the standard, the older models. But I'd buy good quality cards. Obviously, you should always buy really good quality memory cards. Now, when I do weddings, I just put 228GB cards in this. In both bodies, I'll have 2 on me, and that's how I shoot. And I don't change the memory cards out because all the wedding photographers that I know who had problems, well, the main problem they've had is just dropping memory cards. And I write RAW to both of those cards. Now, the other things that it has that are really good about it that I really like, on the top dial here, you get the U1, U2, which are like custom user modes. The D800 doesn't have that. This one does. So you could have 2 different settings for aperture priority, different shutter speed, minimum shutter speeds on both of them. You can have one at 160th of a second and another one at 400th of a second. So you can change if you want to really quickly get a faster minimum shutter speed, and you can grab that. Nice and easy, and it's quite useful to have. Not unique to this body, but the 2 buttons on the front here are programmable. And what I do with the first one is I have the lower one set to spot metering. Now, this is kind of interesting because it's not the only Nikon camera that does this. That's not the point, but the fact is that it does do it. When you have your focus points in the viewfinder, you can make it so that when you spot meter, that it spot meters on the focus point. So most of the time I just use the standard matrix metering, and then when I put my finger on the button on the front here, hold it down, I get spot metering whilst I'm holding that button down. So why is that relevant? Let's say you're doing some pictures quite quickly and suddenly the scene is backlit. If you put the focus point over the person's face and hold that down, it'll ignore all of that background lighting and just expose for the person's face. And then as soon as you let it go again, it goes back to its sort of evaluative matrix metering mode. That's really great, because as soon as the lighting goes a bit weird, or let's say you turn around, you want to capture something, but it's strongly backlit, maybe it's window light, or you're outdoors and it's strong back sunlight, put that focus point over the person, hold that down and then expose for the person, and it'll ignore the bright background. It's so useful when you're shooting in Aperture Priority with auto ISO, when you're doing reportage work, to be able to have that at the press of a button and then release it and it's gone again. Now what I have on the front button at the top is a quick way to enter into here to be able to choose my minimum shutter speed for Aperture Priority. So I can just cycle through and grab the minimum shutter speed that I want the camera to use just by pressing the button on the front of the camera. So if I show you that, it just comes in here like that, and I can just cycle through it. That's useful because if I want to, let's say I'm in a really dark environment and I want to just change it quickly, I can do that. Now I shoot manual most of the time, but there's times of the day where the lighting's really different all the time, and Aperture Priority with auto ISO is a really good option for them, because you need to be capturing the moments, not fiddling around changing shutter speed. You can miss moments like that, so it's better to work with an auto mode for reportage moments like that. A nice feature with these Nikon cameras as well is that when you want to change to auto ISO, you just hold this ISO button down at the back, and then you just rotate the dial on the front, and that just switches auto ISO on and off, and it just cycles through on off on off on off, so you can just do it really quickly. That's really nice. And a general feature for Nikons that I like is the power button being here by your finger. That works really well too. And let's just talk a little bit about the focus system, the way the sensor works, ISO, dynamic range, those kind of things. One of the complaints you'll see with this camera is that the focus points are grouped quite a lot into the middle. That is true, but I've always found that it's well within range of it being okay to use. I've never had any problems with that. It'd be nice if it went further, but it's just not a big deal. ISO performance on it is reasonably good. It's not excellent, but it's good enough. It's certainly good enough for weddings. I'm okay with this camera up to ISO 6400. I rarely need more than ISO 3200. I have shot some winter weddings which have been really dark, but if you've got a wide aperture lens, something like a 35, 1.8 or 1.4, you can get through those situations as well without any trouble too. One thing that I like with this camera though, with its ISO performance, is the grain that it does produce. The noise, the digital noise, is actually quite nice. The Nikons tend to have, the grain tends to be grey, or let's say it doesn't have any colour in it. It's more like a black and white grain, which is pleasing. Sometimes with the Canons, I would find that the grain could be sort of green and purple, and you get that sort of colour noise would intrude into the pictures, and I wasn't quite so keen on that, so I preferred it on Nikons. When it comes to the dynamic range, this has got over 14 stops of dynamic range. Dynamic range is often in the range below ISO 800 and closer to ISO 100, but generally speaking, the high dynamic range scenes where you really need it is going to be outdoors in brighter light. And you're going to be at those lower ISOs anyway, so I think that's fine. And in terms of the autofocus performance itself, the autofocus, I've found it to be very good. I've never had situations where I've been missing. Now, when I had the D750, for example, I can tell that the D750 has better focus. I did a wedding where I shot the D750 and the D600 together, and you know, the only difference I could tell was I preferred the colours from the D600. The D750 had a bit better ISO performance, but in terms of the focus, I mean, it was just, there was nothing there. But I definitely preferred the colours from the D600, the skin tones, the way it works, this artificial indoor lighting. I thought the D600 handled that better, definitely. I thought the colour range was easy to work with, quicker in Lightroom, found the post-production a little bit faster because of that. And so I got rid of the D750s and just went back to having the D600s. I just, I suppose part of that for me was the familiarity with it as well. The battery life goes just on forever. It's the best battery life I've ever seen in the camera. It is crazy. I mean, if you have two of these, you barely go up to half a battery in each one. it's as long as they're in good condition, the batteries. And I would always buy the Nikon batteries. I wouldn't buy third-party ones personally, but yeah, the battery life just goes on and on and on. It really does. I think perhaps because it's a slightly lower powered camera, it just doesn't have anything that's going to really drain it. I found the screen on the back to be good. They do have a slight color cast to them, so I wouldn't say that they're particularly color accurate, but I found that they're very clear, they're very easy to use, especially in bright sunlight. I really like the screens on the back. I found it easy to judge my exposure with as well. It doesn't have live view, that's something to bear in mind, so there's no live view preview. It has a live view, but it's not got the exposure preview, let's say that. So when you change your settings, you don't see that change. It just gives you an automatic kind of, it works out a preview for you. But again, that hasn't really been a big deal. I'm not really bothered about stuff like that. When you shoot a lot of weddings, you get to the point where most of the time you can get quite close to guessing the exposure, and then you just need to make a couple of changes from there. I'm not wasting time using something like live view on a DSLR when I don't anyway when I'm doing weddings, or if I need to do something I can just take a test shot really quickly. It would be nice to have, but for me there's no way that that's a deal breaker. And in terms of durability as well, I've banged it against things, they've been dropped, things like this happen over time. You just have these accidents and they've just kept going. I've not had any issues with that. I know that they have like they're not as well constructed as something like a D800, but then that's fine. I think that, I mean, I've put them through the paces and they've lasted. I think the 24 megapixel range is just really nice to work with for weddings. It gives you enough space to crop, but it doesn't give you ridiculous file sizes. It doesn't strain the computer too much, and you don't end up having to, the problem with file sizes being larger, it's not so much the hard drive space, although it is that, and it does add up, and people can say, oh, you know, hard drives are cheap. Well, who are they cheap for? It's still an expense. They still cost money, and the bigger memory cards that you then need also, or more memory cards, and you have to then switch them out, that also costs money. This stuff adds up. So you have the body's more expensive, the memory card's more expensive, and then the hard drives are more expensive. I really hate it when people say, oh, it's so cheap, just buy it. It's not. Yeah, maybe it is for you, but it's not necessarily for everyone else. So it's not always the case that, oh, it's just cheap, just buy it. Yeah, not everyone's got the money for that all the time. I'm in a position now where I can afford stuff, but I've been in a position where I was borrowing lenses to shoot things and get things done because I just couldn't afford to buy the stuff. So I know what that's like, and it's not easy. Now, as you shoot weddings, you'll be able to upgrade that stuff and buy more if you want to, but I just never found the need to. Why do I need more than 24 megapixels for a wedding? I used to shoot on the 5D Mark I. That's just under 13 megapixels, and I never needed more than that. Quality is about the content of the picture. You know, if your pictures are good, then your pictures are good. And that's something that I'd like to touch on briefly as well with this, is that it's all very, the way we feel about our gear. I think a lot of photographers feel like the gear that they're using somehow signifies how professional they are. And that's not really quite true, because once you've got a camera body that's good enough, then it's up to you whether your work's good enough or not. The people that are around you at weddings have no idea what you're using. Maybe one or two people that are in photography might know. They're not our customer. It doesn't matter. That's not the important thing. The important thing is your work. Because if you're a rubbish photographer and you buy a really expensive camera and your work's rubbish, then your work's just rubbish. It's not going to get you anywhere. If you get the camera and you do really good work, you're going to get more bookings and more work. It's based on the quality of your work, not the gear that you're using. Now, I understand you'll probably want to upgrade over time, but what I'd say to you is take a look at the D600 and D610, because this is a camera body that maybe it'll just be a stepping stone for you. But for me, I just kind of fell in love with it for wedding work, in the way that I would always turn back to that camera, because when you go through experiences of difficult days and it gets you through, you start to form this bond with that camera model. And the D600 did that for me, because there was many days where there was difficult weddings, technically difficult situations, and it got me through that, and that builds a kind of trust, and that trust is a hard bond to break. It doesn't mean that other cameras can't do that too, but I think at this price point, especially where it's at now, is really good opportunity. Now, there's one thing about this camera, which is these oil spots and so on the sensor that you can get. Now, that was known for that, and it happened for a little while, and I've mentioned about this before in previous videos, that my feeling was that Nikon fixes problems and then they don't really say anything about it, but then they had to make the D610 model
just to let people know that they'd done it, but I think a lot of the D600s already had the fix in there. I'm not saying that that's officially what happened, but that's my experience. That's how Nikon works with things. So there was just some of the early ones that had it. My D600s that I've had, none of them had that issue. So I don't think it's... Anyway, I hope that was useful for you. Please give me a thumbs up, drop me a comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.